but the spirit is going somewhere in all of us, and we need to pay attention to that and make sensible, conscious decisions about what we bring into our life and what we don't. And I didn't want to bring that novel into my physical life at that time. Actually, I did, and I was a little bit leery about showing it to women, and my wife refused to read it until I'd had 10 women read it. And so I actually, over a period of time, had 100 women read it, more than. And it happened that I was in a business that was all women at the time, so there were a lot of women around to read. And they all loved it. So I said, okay, well, maybe that's okay then. But from my point of view, circa 1993, I didn't think it was okay at the time. But anyway, the point is that if you enter into the individuation process before you're ready, it can be injurious to your health. And so just beware of that. Each of us has to make our own judgment on that. Okay, so Dr. Jung's reason for looking for a new way was that he didn't have an answer for what he was finding vis-a-vis the collective unconscious. And what he said was that there's some issues that are insoluble without violence to one or the other side of your nature. And what he believed was that at bottom, nothing is insoluble, okay? That remember the psychoid layer now, the unus mundus, which is at the deepest level of the psyche, nothing is insoluble. Jerome says, what did you learn about yourself from the novel? I'll tell you what, Jerome, there are a couple of videos on that topic. I think I have to refer you to those. I actually talked about it twice in group in the reading group. And so what I will do is give you some links and ask you to go take a look at that. In the one that I'll give you, there's a link to the first one. I spoke about it twice in group. Just ask you to go and take a look at those things because I learned a lot. Let's be perfectly clear. I learned a lot about myself and a lot about what had been cooking in my mind for 30 years, believe it or not. And the fundamental idea of this novel is available in the Dropbox, so I'm not trying to sell it to anyone, but it is also available on Amazon. The fundamental principle of it was that Michael Crichton had been interviewed by, I think, the Wall Street Journal at one point about how you go about writing a novel. And I'd read this article, and he was talking about Jurassic Park, and he said, well, the way you write a novel is you ask a question, and then you answer it. And his question for Jurassic Park was, what if you could bring dinosaurs back to life? What then? And so now we're having, I think, the second or third sequel after the original Jurassic Park coming out in July, where we see what can happen, at least in fiction. But my issue was a bit more realistic, which was when I was 15 years old and living in Kamakura, Japan, we had a live-in housekeeper who was 23, a young woman. And I asked my father one day, why Michiko was here with us. Why was Michiko-san here, living here? And he said, well, young farm girls in Japan come to Tokyo to earn their dowry, that quote unquote. So it wasn't a question, he just made that statement. And that statement had cooked in my unconscious for 30 years. And so on this one particular day, which I describe on one of those videos, I was thinking about Crichton's dictum that you should ask a question. And I, since I have a lot of experience in Japan, I lived there 8 years, I said, well, what if such a young woman came to Tokyo? What would that actually be like? Because obviously our live-in housekeeper was very lucky to get a job and live in with an American Navy family in Kamakura. But most young women that come to Tokyo would have a much rougher experience than that. And that's what I had learned in my second session of 5 years when I lived in Tokyo and built a company there. And so I said, well, what if one of those girls came to Tokyo and to earn her dowry and ended up as the first woman prime minister of Japan? That was the question. And what would that life be like? So the novel really covers a period of 60 years in her life, which was ages 15 to 75. And so that's the fundamental story, but it's a lot more rough and ready than that. So I'll just leave it at that for now. And you can watch the videos where I get into it more. Okay, so one of the key points that Dr. Jung makes about neurosis and how to deal with it is that you can grow out of a problem. In other words, you get a new level of consciousness that's higher and wider. You get a new level of maturity, and then what seems like an insoluble problem loses its urgency. And so it isn't solved logically on its own terms. And so I make a note here that my issue with Jordan Peterson's emphasis on logos, I don't really feel I need to debate him on this point because it's going to solve itself, because there are enough people that aren't quite so heavily weighted on the logos side who will adjust that in society over time. And so the problem that I observe in his presentation is that it's going to lose its urgency as people grow up. And meanwhile, he's been very helpful to me, there's no doubt, and I still need help psychologically from time to time, and he's very good, and he's very good about his perspectives on religion, I think. And so, 98% of the time I'm very happy with if I watch a Jordan Peterson video. But I chafe a little bit when he gets a little bit too logosy, but then I think, well, maybe this is for men who haven't been properly fathered, and they need that kind of guidance. But a rigid father's guidance doesn't always win. I remember, and often life gets in the way and experience changes your perspective. But I remember Representative Scalise, when he was shot last summer. Well, he's the one that was shot last summer, but so I'm just bringing your attention to who I'm talking about. Now, before that, though, one time, I think it was Bannon went up on Capitol Hill, and the president wanted Congress to vote in a certain way, which they didn't really want to do. And the Republican caucus had gotten quite a talking to by Steve Bannon. And Scalise came out of that meeting and said, I haven't been spoken like that since my father did it to me when I was 18 years old, and I didn't do what he wanted either. And so anyway, perceived problems can be grown out of. So at the lower level of consciousness, you can have wild conflicts and outbursts. So you can remember your teenagers, for example, how they can be pretty wild, and yet once they get more experience, they change. And so at the higher levels of consciousness, then you get new and stronger life urges with your maturity. And so it becomes like a storm down in the valley seen from a mountaintop at a higher level. And in Buddhism, they talk about the sky-like quality of mind, where they talk about when you're taking off in an airplane and you look down on the clouds down below you, and all the problems that you saw before are down there, but everything's cool up above you. It's beautiful blue sky. And so in Buddhism, they teach you it's all illusion. Well, okay, it's not all illusion, but you learn how to deal with it, whatever it is. So the old saying that most Americans know is, don't sweat the small stuff, it's all small stuff. And it's hard to say that to a teenager. And so I remember one of the things that really ripped me when I lived in Japan as a teenager, I was in 10th to 12th grades there, and all of my friends had motorcycles. Now, these were pretty pathetic motorcycles, because if you were under 18 in Japan, you could only get a license for a 50cc motorcycle. But nonetheless, we called them motorcycles in those days. And so all of my male friends in my Navy high school in Yokohama had motorcycles except for me. And my father forbid me to have one. And I was really ripped about that at the time. And I guess I still am at some level, although I've grown out of it. But anyway, in the fullness of time, then when I was about 30, the man across the street, who was also 30 and the father of two, killed himself on a motorcycle. And I said, maybe it was not a bad thing that I wasn't on a motorcycle. It made me grow up and learn different things to do, and I had to learn how to get around Japan through public transportation systems, which was a very good experience. There's a lot to talk about there, but so the issue is that we're both the mountain and the valley. So I don't know if this is a Christ quote or a Jung quote, but the quote is, "I know that I suffer." Okay, so I suffered over the motorcycle decision. But, in the fullness of time, it wasn't that big of a deal. But what made it a little bit bigger deal was that when I left for college, my parents stayed in Japan another 15 months. And 3 weeks after I left for college, they bought a motorcycle that my brother could drive. I said, what? Anyway, such is life. Okay. So paragraph 18, Dr. Jung is saying that all the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. Now, that's a big idea to think about. But what he says is they express the necessary polarity inherent in every self-regulating system. And they're not solved, they're outgrown. You get a new thing from obscure possibilities, things that you weren't expecting, but something new comes up out of unknown potentialities. And so in paragraph 19, then he's talking about the new thing, and he says that it never comes only from the outside or the inside. It can't be pigeonholed, and it turns out to be a strangely appropriate expression of the total person. And I admit it. Now I get around in Japan, like a native, more than a native. I mean, when I left after living there 8 years, I called myself Edo Ko, which means son of old Japan, and it was definitely true that Japanese friends from outside of Tokyo would come to visit, and I would know far more about Tokyo and be able to take them on tours. So paragraph 20 then, the advice from the Golden Flower is let things happen. Consciousness is forever interfering with psychic processes. And consciousness will have numerous objections, and you're better off just going with the flow. I mean, that's a Taoist point of view, but things will change, and a new thing will emerge. And he says in paragraph 21, there's a temptation to categorize, which, all of that logos and all that scientific method wants to categorize everything. And the point is that the conscious activity needs to be switched off. I mean, that's what the Tao is to go meditate, right? And just see how this comes up. Because before we get to the end of tonight, I'm just going to show you this one other picture here that I set up for you. Okay, so when I was 15 years old, I moved to Kamakura, Japan, which is the home of Daibutsu, the Great Buddha. And I've had 3 perceptions about this Great Buddha over my lifetime. The first was when I was 15, I'm saying, what is this guy doing, and why do we care? And of course, no one when I was 15 years old was trying to explain it to me. But when I was there in my mid to late 30s and around 40, I did understand by that time that he was meditating. And now, and in my 70s, I understand the value of meditating. Okay, so this Buddha has been sitting here since 1295, and it was originally surrounded by the largest wooden building in the world. It relinquished that honor in 1492, the same year that Columbus came to the New World, or maybe it was 1495, but about that same time. So now the largest building in the world is around a Great Buddha in Kyoto. But in 1495 or so, a tsunami came in and it came all the way up to this great Buddha and washed the building away. Now, that must have been one hell of a tsunami, because I've climbed the hill that this Buddha is on, and it must be at least 200 feet above sea level. And Kamakura is a beach town, so it's, there is a beach there on Sagami Bay, but for a tsunami to carry away the building that surrounded this Buddha is just phenomenal. It must have been really terrible, way more than the Fukushima tsunami. And so, anyway, it's bronze, and it's been sitting there for 800 years, whatever. In paragraph 22, then, we tend to develop tenuous webs of fantasy, and it's usually one way. We ought to write them down. And these fantasies, we should model them or draw them or in some way, because they're foreign to the conscious mind. So they come up in dreams also. And, you should accept whatever comes up, because that's coming from yourself, from the psyche. And you have to let that happen until the cramp is removed. I'm going to just change the scene now. This is my contact information in case you're interested in the Dropbox for the public group, or the Dropbox for the advanced group. And so here in this paragraph 22, I think what he's talking about is people who are having a depression, some sort of depression or something like that, and they have a cramp in their style, or they don't have enough self-esteem, or whatever. And what Dr. Jung's advice for people was to draw it, or to draw a mandala, or write it down in some way until you can let things happen more, until things can be more instinctual again. And the problem that he was always faced with in Europeans was the people had removed themselves so far from instinct that they couldn't live happily, basically. And so one of the things he was trying to do was to reestablish that connection on the instinct to spiritual continuum there. And you need to accept whatever comes along. So this is why my little trick of the adult coloring book can work, because if you just, let your psyche decide what color is going to go in that square, once your psyche knows that you're paying attention to it yourself, then you're going to get more, and you'll start to get a flood of information. Paragraph 24, Jung says we must accept occupations which come to us. When things come, we understand them from the ground up, and we have to hang on. But this can swing too far, and so I thought my thing would be being a lawyer, and for the longest time, I thought that was the right thing for me, and so I went to law school, which I enjoyed very much. It was an interesting challenge. And I practiced law for 5 years. And what I found out was that I detest the practice of law. And so then you have to find another line of work. And, I did it in a surprising way, but I definitely did it. All right, so one of the things that Jung says in paragraph 25, and this goes back now to my Buddha here, is that Westerner has authority against him in meditation, because at a higher level you don't have the rear guard or the shelter that would come up if you had built up to meditation instinctively. So yes, you can meditate, and yes, it can be great for you, but a Chinese would meditate in an entirely different way. He says that, your conscious integrity stops an absurd misadventure. So some ideas can come up that maybe aren't too good. And you can imagine, as a 15-year-old boy, any number of ideas could have come up in my mind about what I was going to do about Japan and my life in Japan and so on. And ultimately, I did have to go back as a businessman and play that experience out as an expatriate. And I did it.